it is a privilege to be here, and I do like to travel. I travel extensively, but I also like to travel locally, and Victoria has for a long time been a really special place for me. But I rarely get to fly into the harbor, and I did yesterday, and I thought if I ever stop feeling privileged to live here and to just see the beauty, then just shoot me, because it's just so nice to be here. Thanks. So I feel quite humble, actually, coming to speak to you. So thanks for saying such nice things about me. It's always interesting to, Visi said, I want to figure out how you tick. And I thought, good, I'll listen, and I'll find out from her everything there is to know about me. But when it comes to diversity, I'm really humble, because I don't know. And you've brought me in to try to help share some information, and I know some information, and I speak internationally on this topic, and I write textbook chapters on this topic. So it's not that I don't know anything, but the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. And I look at the diversity in the room, and I look at the wisdom that you're bringing, and I'm so glad that we have the Global Cafe conversations afterward, because that's when your real learning is going to happen today. It's not going to be from me. All I can do is share some of my experiences. I have traveled, lived, worked, spoken in more than 60 countries, and every country that I go to, one of the big learnings for me from that country is that I don't know anything. So I need to travel. I need to remember and experience what it's like to be from away. I need to know what it's like not to be able to speak the language fluently, not to understand some of the rules about booking hotel rooms or traveling that make complete sense to me somewhere else and apparently don't make sense wherever I am. I need those experiences because it reminds me of how brave and how amazing those of you that have come to Canada are. The other thing that embarrasses me as a Canadian, and I'm quite happy to talk to people in Ottawa about how I feel about this, and I do, but this notion of, if you don't have Canadian experience, then you can't work here, makes me crazy. As Canadians, we're a tiny little blip in the universe. Our population of the entire country would fit in some major world cities. If we think those cities aren't operating with technology that surpasses the technology that we have in Canada, then we're living with our head in the sand. And so just to give you a short example, and then I'll move on to my real slides. I'm conscious of time, but my husband was a private banker. And a private banker is the person who deals with the top 3 to 5% of the wealth management clients. And one of his clients, so you can imagine this is a wealthy person, is from Mexico. But he does have a summer home. Like a few Canadians, not so many, more in the East have summer homes, but his summer home was a floor of the Sylvia Apartments next to the Sylvia Hotel because he liked to watch the fireworks. And so he had the 6th floor balcony so he could watch the fireworks. That was his summer home that he used for a couple of weeks of the year. So this is a really wealthy international businessman. And he was in a business conversation with a Canadian, and it wasn't in Victoria, so it wasn't with any of you. But he was in a business conversation with a Canadian, trying to decide whether he was going to invest in a new business. And the conversation ended with, when you go back to Mexico, how am I going to be able to reach you? Surely you don't have email. So it's statements like that that make us look foolish. It makes us look, as Canadian business people, as employers, as citizens, like really back in time, that we just don't understand how the world functions. We had a conversation in our speed dating where you asked me how far south I went, and my husband, if he were here, would actually really laugh when you said you need to know geography, because at one point I thought Kathmandu was a seaport. So I don't know geography well. I fly and I experience the culture there, but I'm not so good at looking at maps. But when we travel, we need to increase that awareness. I spoke to someone during breakfast who said that one of her volunteers said, I don't need to travel, I can learn everything I need to know about the world from books. And yes and no. There's lots we can learn. There's lots we can learn from history. There's lots we can learn from life stories. But the world is changing so quickly that if our understanding of Africa is what we've seen in a World Vision ad, or if our understanding of China is what we've seen in a news story about a factory that is not up to standard, then we're missing a really big part of how the world is changing, and we're getting left behind. The other sort of background piece I wanted to give you is I was part of Team Canada on at an international policy conference in Sydney, Australia a few years ago. And at that conference, there were 57 countries. At some point, I was certain someone from each of those 57 countries came to the Canadian team and said, what is going on in Canada? Why is it that you bring in doctors and you bring in engineers and you bring in highly skilled people and they're driving taxi? Like, I don't understand that. And we said, well, we don't understand it either, but we can explain a little bit how it happens. So, what we explained was that in Canada we've got this federal system that awards points and brings, people in according to the points that they've earned, but that our provinces regulate professions. And they said, so fix it. It sounds simple. So we're working on it. But we said, if you can fix it, come to Canada. Of course, if they came to Canada, they'd be driving a taxi. And so we've got this disconnect that is an unbelievable disconnect. But what I wanted to share with you about that Australia conference is it was in an amazing setting like this. Except instead of looking out at grass, I was looking out at surf. So the conference setting was right on the beach. I don't know why they would have set up the room so that the audience was looking at the beach, because we weren't paying a lot of attention to the speaker. So thank you for blocking the view. But anyway, I'm looking at this Australian Labour Minister. And I wasn't paying a lot of attention because there were surfers and tropical birds and lots to look at. But I heard him say, we're facing a skill shortage in Australia, but we've got the solution. I thought, oh, this is why I'm here, because I'm supposed to learn about solutions to skill shortages. And he said, our solution is immigrants. And I thought, oh, shoot, because that's our solution too. And you're bringing people to Australia, and we're bringing people to Thompson, Manitoba, and to Nunavut, and to Prince Rupert. Like Victoria, you can compete, but not a lot of other places in Canada. So we are not alone in trying to recruit skilled immigrants to solve our skill shortage problem. The rest of the world figured that out too. And if we don't get that the rest of the world is competing for the same skilled immigrants, we're not going to keep them. Because the other key thing that we need to understand is that many of the people that we see and consider immigrants really aren't immigrants, they're global careerists. If my next door neighbor were to go to Kazakhstan to work in oil in Kazakhstan, it would never cross our mind, never, to consider that he had emigrated from Canada, immigrated to Kazakhstan. That's not the language we would use. He's an expat. He's a global worker. He's an international worker. We totally get that when it's one of our friends or one of our relatives that goes and works abroad. My next door neighbor happens to be a Korean mother who moved here so her son could go to school here, family still back in Korea. She would be viewed as an immigrant. She's not viewed as an international worker, a global family, a global careerist. And until we figure that out, we're going to lose the competition. Because if an international worker comes to Canada, absolutely there's immigration, and I understand how the immigration system works, and I understand about visas and all of that. So I'm not saying that technically people aren't immigrants. But I'm saying until we understand this notion of what the global workplace looks like today, we are going to be left behind. Because the skilled workers we've worked so hard to attract are going to put in some time here, maybe if they can see that it's moving them in the direction of their career. But they're on the internet too. And if Brazil needs them, or if Australia needs them, or if New Zealand needs them, they're going to go to opportunities where they can use their skills. I was working in Jakarta, Indonesia, a few months ago. And if I would have arrived in Jakarta, which could conceivably happen, things change. If I'd arrived in Jakarta, got to the airport, and they said, oh, Roberta, my goodness, the university closed. we don't have work for you, but we could probably get you a job in hotel housekeeping. Would I stay? Like, I hadn't immigrated to Jakarta. I'd gone to Jakarta to teach in the university. Why wouldn't I just go to Bali and spend the extra time there? Why wouldn't I call up my friends in Hong Kong and say, I've got a free week. Do you want me to come and teach for you? As a global international worker, you get that about me. Why don't we get it when a doctor arrives here? Because we say we have a doctor shortage. So a doctor comes here to help Canada out, to meet our needs. And we say, and this is a true quote, well, you can't be a doctor here, but you could be a dishwasher. That's embarrassing. That's insulting. And it happens. And so that's what I'm hoping to get you to think about today. I don't have all the solutions, but I think one of the solutions is awareness and just thinking differently about the situation that we found ourselves in. So quickly, I'm assuming you still want me to finish around 10, right? Okay. So we're going to just look at some basics around diversity. We're going to talk about how to reach out to some of the diverse candidates that might fill some of your work positions, volunteer positions, needs in the community. After reaching out to them, how are you going to encourage them to apply? So we'll talk a little bit about that. I just finished doing or leading a project on foreign credential recognition issues, and so that's part of our recruitment issues. How do we get people so that they can be licensed to work in their field? So we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's a whole other discussion. Our report, we wrote a really comprehensive report on it, won't be released, and so there's just all sorts of political stuff that makes it really complicated to follow through on work that's being done. They haven't said I can't speak about it though. So I'm allowed to speak from my notes. I'm just not allowed to publish the report other than the funder. Interviewing and selecting diverse candidates and then welcoming new employees. So I wanted to start by acknowledging that our focus today is on newcomers. But really, when we talk about diversity, there are many, many underrepresented groups in our workplaces. And there's also many people in your workplace that have a diverse background that they're not able to talk about. And KPMG did some research a few years ago to look into the lost productivity from people not being able to honestly talk about their diversity. And so that might be a gay person on the weekend who, people are saying, well, what did you do on the weekend? And the person has to censor his conversation to try to not let on that he's gay. Those conversations take time and mental energy. And if that conversation is repeated casually 4 or 5 times during the day, an hour is used up in creative storytelling. It could be a member of a political party who is not able to say that they were at the convention on the weekend because everyone knows what convention was on the weekend, and so that's going to give away what party they're part of. It could be someone who's part of a spiritual community. And so they know if they were to acknowledge what they were doing on the weekend, it's not going to be accepted by the other members of the team. It could be someone with an invisible disability, a mental health issue that's well taken care of with medication, but an absolute fear that if I ever mention I'm on medication for depression or anxiety or whatever, it's a CLM, that's a career limiting move. And so there's a lot of people that are just silenced about issues that could be part of normal conversation and really help us understand the diversity of the folks in the room with us. And huge value, as we'll talk about, to building a diverse workplace, because that diverse workplace is going to connect with other folks and other communities and help you reach out to fully embrace the whole community of the Victoria area. But if we build a diverse workforce, if our attention is how to bring people in and we don't work on how to teach our existing workers to be more inclusive, then we're really not solving a problem. It's not a trick to bring people in. Offer people enough of an incentive and people will join your team. The problem is, are they going to stay? And if you've just got this churn of people coming in that won't stay because they don't fit in, because the food they heat up in the microwave doesn't smell the same as other people's food, or because what they're talking in their lunch break in another language and that's bothering people. If we can't build an inclusive workforce, we're not going to be able to retain people. So then there's no point working on the recruitment strategies. So I know that's a whole other workshop. So I like this quote from Future Perfect author Stephen Johnson. He talks about research that says diversity trumps ability. Think about that. If you were to build a diverse workforce rather than recruiting only for the best skills for a position, his research suggests that you've actually got a better, more effective workforce. Not as a nice thing to have. This would be as a business case. And he said a large group of diverse group of non-experts often outperforms a small group of experts. So you're the large group here. I don't want to call you non-experts, but a diverse group in this room. You truly have more information and can solve these 3 questions better than I could with my research team working in isolation. You need to believe that. You need to understand that, and then you'll get that having a diverse workplace is actually going to make you more competitive. So that's a super important piece of research. Now the presentation that you saw at the conference was using a Prezi. I don't know if any of you have used Prezi instead of PowerPoint, but it's way more fun. So it was a Prezi where I based the trips out of Vancouver, but I went to all these different parts in the world just doing a photo display of the difference that I'd seen. So we've picked a few of them out because the actual Prezi didn't fit so much and we don't have as much time here. This is me. It's too dark for you to see, but that's me going by taxi to the conference I was presenting in. I'm actually wearing the same jacket, I think, carrying my briefcase, heading off to work. So that is India. And that's often the vision that we keep in our mind of India. But this is India too. The Commonwealth Games were on at the time, and we were standing in a plaza and we were watching the Commonwealth Games on a big screen TV. And here's me at the airport, I think in Mumbai, teaching university in Canada. I'm on my laptop, I'm teaching my online course, I'm using the internet access at the airport. This is India, all of it together. And so if we're holding into our head the pictures of, poor people living in, slums, absolutely that exists. I've, driven down a road, I wasn't driving, that's for sure, down a road in India and seen an elephant on the same road, absolutely. But if we believe that somehow doesn't mean that there are people working in skyscrapers using technology that is far more advanced than the technology we have access to, then we're forming an incomplete picture in our mind. Similarly, this is, where is it? It's South America. And absolutely, you can find, different poor areas that people are in, and I deliberately tour them. And I had the most amazing experience actually in Brazil, in a community where they were teaching kids how, it was a craft kind of business, and I used to have a craft business. They were teaching kids how to make crafts, but also how to sell them, and in selling them, how to interact with the tourists, and doing it so professionally. And so we stopped, and this young man was trying to sell me something, and you could tell he'd been trained. He just reminded me of our students. And you could tell he'd been trained to be fair and to present everyone else's art similarly, right? And to be watching me and monitoring what I liked. And he was trying so hard. But then he'd get to his art, and he was really, really proud of his art. And because he was so proud of his art, then I would smile and get engaged. So then he realized that probably I did want to hear more about his art, and that's what I bought. But he was trying so hard to be fair. So it was an awesome training program for him. However, that's the Panama Canal. That's pretty fancy technology. This is a shopping mall that I couldn't afford to shop in, that has really fancy stuff. We need to realize that these two worlds coexist. And it would be like if a tourist had come to Canada and gone to some of our First Nations communities that are really third world conditions in a lot of cases, and took photographs of that and said, this is Canada. That's the same thing as if we go to another country and take pictures of that and say, this is that country. It's a snapshot of the country. It might be even something that interested us, but it is not the whole country. And until we recognize that the immigrants that are coming to us with amazing skills in managing very, very complex projects or dealing with very complicated medical conditions using the exact same technology or better than we have here. We need to paint that picture in our mind. This is in Israel, and you'll have seen pictures at the Wailing Wall. But so is this. I like wine, so that's a winery, but a very high-tech winery. A big business building, a skyscraper, super highways. All of that is also Israel. But when we travel, we tend to go, I'm going to Istanbul, I'm going to stay in the old part of town. I want to see the Blue Mosque. Of course, we're going to be interested and intrigued by some of the older things. But if I walk away from Istanbul thinking that's all that's there, then I'm not going to embrace someone who's come from Turkey to work in Canada and think that they can bring the 2013 kind of knowledge that I need them to have. We were having a conversation about, with my geography limitations, about where I'd been the furthest south. And I said Santiago, Chile, which it turns out isn't true. So you pulled out your phone and are Googling latitudes for all of these cities. Well, that same action could have happened if we were in Rio. That same action could have happened if we were in Poland. We have access to the same internet. And so people all over the world are gathering information from the same sources. We need to keep that in mind. So to encourage you to embrace diversity and make the business case for embracing diversity, then it's important to recognize, and you know all of this, so I'm not going to go through it in detail, but there is a business case to be made. You are reaching out to different communities. You're doing things more effectively. It can address your labor shortages. There's all sorts of good reasons for embracing diversity. We developed on a project a few years ago something called the SEED Toolkit, and SEED stands for Supporting Employers Embracing Diversity. You won't see it in the print form. We just printed a few of them to show people, but it's a web-based tool, so it's freely available to you. And we developed a model that is ROI, on purpose because of return on investment, but the ROI stands for Recruitment, Orientation, and Inclusion. And the focus today is going to be more on recruitment, but I don't want you to overlook the importance of orientation. Often when we think of orientation, we think of it for the newcomers. We think of orientation to bring someone in. That's not the only orientation. That's important, but that's not the only orientation I'm talking about. We also, if we're going to bring in newcomers, we need to orient the existing employees. Because if we're not taking the time to do that appropriately and help our existing employees get why we're bringing in people that might appear a little bit different, then we're not going to have that stickiness. They aren't going to stay because our newcomers won't be welcomed. At the very senior level, I taught in the Faculty of Business at SFU a few years ago, and at the time, Dean Shapiro was past retirement age, just sort of hanging in there. And so he was a very influential man. The dean of the Faculty of Business at a university, had many friends that were CEOs in some of the big downtown Vancouver firms. And he was very interested in what in those days was called the Association for Mentally Handicapped. We don't use that language anymore, it's community living, but in those days that was the politically correct language of the time. And so he was on the board, and he had an idea that it was time to have real pay for real work, like include people in communities, but where they're doing real jobs that they're suited to do and being paid a living wage. And his CEO buddies got it. They were totally behind this. They thought, what a wonderful idea. And so those CEO buddies called their senior leaders around, and they got it. They thought, yeah, we're in. What a wonderful idea. And those senior leaders called their managers around, and their managers got it and said, yeah, what a wonderful idea, we're in. And then they called the frontline supervisors. And it's a wonderful idea, but not in my department. So that's that whole NIMBY thing, not in my backyard. The dean of the Faculty of Business at SFU, in combination with CEOs of the largest companies in Vancouver, could not place a single person from that association, not one. So if you have an idea at the senior level and you've got buy-in at the senior level, until you find a way of working it through your organization, the newcomers you bring in are going to have to work beside the people that don't believe it can happen. And until you work through that issue, you've got a problem. So in the SEED Toolkit, there is a diversity champion's background and guide, and we built this notion of a diversity champion who doesn't have to be a senior person on your team. In fact, when we were doing this project, we rolled it out in our own organization as well, and our diversity champion was our summer student. And she was so keen and excited, and she was constantly sending us new quotes to put in our signature line and making posters and stuff like that. It was not a full-time job. It was an off the side of her desk job, but it was a description, or the part of her job description. She was expected to take care of making sure that we remained aware of diversity. And so you can, if you have a diversity champion, it's going to be on somebody's agenda. It's going to be on somebody's radar screen to get the word out and continue to engage people in diversity conversations. There's also a cultural diversity yearbook. It's helpful to know when different cultural events are and to have someone in charge of monitoring that and updating it, because many cultural events, including Easter, changes. It's at different times of year, so you can't assume because Ramadan was at a certain time one year, it's going to be at a certain time the next year. So you really need someone that's going to stay on top of that. In the yearbook, you'll also find a diversity, some quotes that you can use, some discussion starters, and tools like that. From a recruitment perspective, I just wanted to briefly show this video.
Sorry, you were saying?
I saw an interesting chap yesterday. Really? Master's degree.
From?
University in Canada.
Any good?
Don't know. It is Canada.
Any work experience?
5 years on major projects, but only in Canada.
That doesn't really count for much here, does it?
Exactly. And his accent.
So why are we talking about it?
He's seeing the competition tomorrow.
Oh.
T.
Don't close your mind to opportunity. Hire a skilled immigrant.
So the reason I show that, I don't know how much of the detail you could hear, but it was in India or Pakistan, and they were going to be interviewing a Canadian, and they were talking about this Canadian, and do you think he could work here? Well, he's had experience, but the experience is only in Canada. And that accent, whew, hard to understand that accent. And so we don't think how silly we sound when we're having the same conversation here. Well, I'm interviewing someone, he has a MBA, but he worked on the Yangtze River Dam project, the Three Gorges Dam in China, but it was in China. Well, yeah, and it's a pretty big project. So how is it that we're not valuing experience just because it's come from another country? We would be shocked if we had that conversation or if we overheard that conversation in India. So we just need to have awareness. So from a culturally sensitive hiring practices perspective, it is important to look at our ads and make sure that they're bias-free. Partly that's using plain language just so people can actually understand what it is you're asking for. But partly as well, if you actually go through ads, you'll see for sure the Canadian experience thing, that you must have 5 years of Canadian experience. Sometimes there's a clear bias there. But there might be other kinds of bias that give people a really clear sense that there's no point them applying. They might need a certain certification that really isn't essential to do the job, but it's what we're using for screening. And so we just have to be careful about that. We need to recognize international credentials and experience. Now this is harder than it looks. Recognizing international experience, any of us can do. But wherever there's a regulated profession, people aren't necessarily licensed to practice in their profession unless their credentials can be recognized. We know from research that there are huge roadblocks within the professional associations. If anyone's here from a professional association, I apologize to you. I know it's complicated as well for people within the professional associations, but until those roadblocks are dealt with, there's no guarantee that we can actually quickly move a medical doctor into medical practice, move an engineer into engineering practice. But surely we can get them closer. Surely we can help people move into work that is going to be closer. And I don't mean, oh, well, you could be a security guard in a hospital because then you'd be hanging out with doctors. Doctors typically do not hire security guards for their medical practices. Right? Like that, you're getting closer. You might know someone that then you could go golf with, but this is not going to be building a professional relationship. So the work that we're doing, and now I'm speaking to the employment counselors in the room, the work that we're doing sometimes in helping people get Canadian experience isn't counting when they move on to their professional experience because they say, well, it wasn't Canadian experience in your profession. So we really have to be intentional about the work experience that we're helping people acquire or volunteer experience. We need to be prepared to look for references that might not be Canadian references. So is the person that someone is using as a reference from Taiwan, from Saudi Arabia, is that person fluent in English? Could I pick up the phone? Could I have a Skype conversation and still paint a picture of someone? Does it have to be a Canadian reference? What makes a Canadian reference any less biased? We can communicate comfortably by Skype with people. I do counseling with people in other parts of the world, and so there's no reason we couldn't check out a reference and have a conversation with someone. The no Canadian experience is really an excuse not to hire, and it's just not even possible to get Canadian experience if you just got off the plane. So, recognize that and say, how can I maybe set up some kind of a probationary term? How can I set up, some other alternative? Perhaps work alongside someone for a short period of time. Many of our immigrant, internationally trained professionals would be happy to work at a much lower salary than their professional salary if it meant they were in the short term, if it meant they were in the workplace actually demonstrating the skills and knowledge they have that was then going to be evaluated at the end of 2 or 3 months, and they'd be able to move into their profession. So there would be ways of making that work. I know if you're in a unionized environment, there's complications, and if it's a regulated profession, it's complicated. But there are ways of helping people get the experience that they need, or even qualifying, was that international experience perhaps Canadian experience? I toured a Canadian computer manufacturing facility in Malaysia, in Penang. They only had one immigrant working at that facility, and that one immigrant was from Singapore, which is just at the tip of Malaysia. So really, it was entirely 100% staffed right up to the senior level by Malaysians, a Canadian-owned company. So that person technically has Canadian experience. Are we assuming because somebody has worked in another country that they don't have Canadian experience? Perhaps that's not a safe assumption. Telephone screening, clearly for anyone who has English not as their first language. I don't like English as a second language because usually it's as a sixth language or seventh, so saying it's as a second language is just insulting as well. But telephone screening can be difficult because if I'm trying to communicate on the phone in a language that isn't my first language, it's more difficult to communicate than if I'm able to speak in person. So bring someone in, use a Skype call, use a video call, something that you're going to be able to get those extra clues. And then appreciate that the resume or cover letter may not look exactly the way you expect it to look. That's okay. And there's really good resumes from other countries that look quite different from Canadian countries or resumes. And then support your applicants to overcome their language issues. So I've really had to struggle with this myself. I have a PhD. The work that my company does is very academic sometimes, and a lot of writing and publishing. So I need people that can write well. And so I typically hadn't hired immigrants for those positions. And then I started to rethink every member of my staff, including people with Canadian degrees that were Canadian born, that have gone through school in Canada, can't write. Every one of them. We do not do a good job in the Canadian school system of teaching people to write or edit or proofread. So I was a journal editor. People who've written textbooks that you've probably read submitted articles to my journal, and I had to edit them. They weren't error-free. And so why would I be using, someone can't write error-free as the reason to not bring them into my company? There's so much else I can offer. I'm going to have to proofread everyone else's work anyway. So why not just build that in as part of the task? So in terms of where to advertise, how are you going to reach out to people? One of the places that you might consider would be through settlement agencies. You mentioned that that's part of the work that you do, because that's reaching people when they first arrive or very soon after they've arrived. You might also want to reach out to some of the language or bridge training programs. Bridge training programs are special programs that are set up to help people fast track or reasonably fast track into different regulated occupations. So if you can reach out to those kinds of programs that are within your sector or within your field, you're going to get some people that are getting the pieces they need to be qualified, but they're going to need some work experience. And you might even be able to bring them in a little bit sooner. You might want to be looking at some of the immigrant media. I read an interesting journal reflection from one of my students from China who was in Canada for a year in the program you were talking about. And as I was reading it, I was just quite surprised to read one of her disappointments was that there was no place to speak English in Vancouver. And then I started to pay attention to the Chinese radio stations and the Chinese TV stations and the conversation I was hearing in the mall, and realizing that when I go to Bangkok in Thailand, I don't actually speak Thai. I've never spoken Thai in Bangkok, because what I'm going to do is naturally seek out the people that speak English. The people in the stores that can serve me are the ones that speak English. The people in the stores that could serve this woman are the ones that speak Chinese. And so in a global society, it's really natural. I'm not even going to go into a restaurant where the sign isn't in English, because you know what? I don't know it's a restaurant. I can't read the word in Thai. And so we're going to naturally seek out the places that already have given us an indication we speak that language. So if you're trying to encourage people to come to work for you because you're trying to be inclusive of a different community, you might want to check your signage. You might want to be advertising in language newspapers that people are picking up and reading, or on radio stations or radio shows that they're listening to. And then obviously any HR consultants or agencies that are in the placement business. So if you're looking down your potential recruitment barriers, then ask yourself, is it possibly at the job description level? Am I asking for something in this job description that is going to give a really clear message to a newcomer that they shouldn't apply? So check what the language you're using on your website, on the careers page of your website, in any ads that you might be writing. Check how you're communicating about the job opening. How do people know what jobs are available? If you are trying to recruit volunteers, and the only way you're recruiting volunteers is through the volunteers you already have, they're hanging out with the same kind of people. We hang out with people that are like us. That's just a really natural human phenomenon. So if you want to reach out beyond the people that are commonly working in your organization, you need to strategically go beyond your normal networks. What are you doing at the level of screening resumes? Who's screening your resumes? Very often, if there's an abundance of resumes that come in, that becomes a frontline administrative clerical position. Does that person know enough about the job to be able to read between the lines and understand if a slightly different word is being used to describe certain skills? So you may need to be involved at the resume screening process at a more senior level, where you can sort of look through and say, hey, this is interesting. I could really see value in bringing this skill set onto the team. Because if I ask my assistants to screen, they're quite religious about going through exactly what I've told them to look for. But they're not going to back up and take that big picture look at, wow, I could really see this person working on this project. Or, yeah, this person doesn't have, the Canadian credential I need. I'm a certified counselor. I might be hiring someone, but I could use them as a coach. If they've got a similar enough approach, I might not need to have someone that's a certified counselor, so I could bring someone in to do very similar work, and then find some help for them in terms of getting the certification that they might need ultimately. Are you conducting phone interviews, and is that part of the problem for you? What are you doing to test candidates? Now, this isn't specific to immigrants, but I had a conversation with TELUS a few years ago, and they were, it was just a lunchtime conversation. I was there consulting for something else, but I do a lot of testing, a lot of psychometric testing, and this HR person said, we are having such a problem right now. We can't find anyone that can pass a typing test. I thought, everyone is typing these days. Like, what's the big deal? And he said, we just can't find anyone that can pass our typing test, not straight out of school. It's a real problem. The only people we can find that can pass a typing test these days are older workers. And I thought, that doesn't make sense. And so we're having this conversation, and I said, so what is it that, what are you doing? And then I started to think, typing. And I said, how are you doing your typing test? On a typewriter. I said, do you even have one of those? I said, is there any department in this entire building that's using a typewriter? No, we just keep one in the testing room. I said, do you think that the candidates that you're testing straight out of high school have ever seen a typewriter? Like, do they know what to do about enter and stuff like that? They never thought that their testing hadn't kept up with the realities of the workplace. And so that's a silly example, but it's a true example. So what are you doing in testing your candidates, whether it's formal or informal, that is screening out potential applicants that would be good applicants? So just ask yourself what's plain silly and think about that typewriter. And then what's happening at the face-to-face interview stage? So think about, if you're having a problem at recruitment, at what point is it falling apart for you? So in terms of broadening recruitment strategies, what strategies, and you're going to be able to have some conversations in your Global Cafe that are quite similar to this, but what strategies are you using and why? And of the ones that you don't use, could you integrate any of them? So is there a way of broadening your reach so that you're actually bringing in the folks that you want to? Or at an orientation level, all I wanted to do to sort of summarize this piece is remind you that orientation can't be just focused on the newcomer. You want to be focusing your orientation as well on your incumbents, because if you don't do that well, then people aren't going to make it through probation, and it's no fault of the newcomer. It's that it's such an uncomfortable place to work that they're getting sick and not able to continue to come back because there's so much stress. So really pay attention to that. But when you are focusing on the newcomer, watch for information overload. Lots of times people come in, and in some cultures will be more inclined to just agree with anything you say because that's respectful. They're not going to acknowledge that anything is wrong or a concern, and would in fact be owning that themselves, thinking there's something wrong with me if I don't get this. So you really need to not talk down, and this is super important. It's verifying, it's checking out, it's conversing with your newcomers, asking questions that allow them to demonstrate that they do understand, giving them an opportunity to do a small task and then get some feedback on how to change that. But it's not talking down to someone. I've seen, this is an example that I'm sure wouldn't be true for anyone here, but it was a representative from the Government of Canada at a workshop that I was facilitating, and the audience were professional immigrants, professionally trained, internationally trained professionals. And it was on resume writing and sort of job search skills. And this representative from the Government of Canada said it's really important to brush your teeth before an interview. Like that information I'm not even sure I would need to give to most high school students. I'm really confident I don't need to give it to most doctors or airline pilots or people that were in the room. And so what's happening is we're speaking to people who need a piece of information. They need to understand what a Canadian resume looks like. They need to understand what kinds of questions we might ask in an interview. All that's fair enough. But you start with the people that are in front of you. You start at the level of professional competency that they're already bringing to you and build from there. And there are so many just outrageous stories like that I could tell you. So mentors or buddies can be really helpful, customizing for diverse groups, and measuring your outcomes, really paying attention to that. So from an inclusion perspective, you've got the handouts in front of you, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but at a big picture level, when you're introducing any kind of a change, there's going to be a variety of reactions. And so some of your staff, your existing staff, are going to be very committed. When I talked about Dean Shapiro and his CEO buddies, they were at that commitment level. They wanted change to happen. Some are going to be a little bit less so, but they'll comply. I don't really get it. I don't think it's that great of an idea, but if you say we're going to do this, I'm in. Some are going to formally comply. They can tell you why you're doing it. They don't buy in at all, but they're not going to be openly hostile. Some are going to give you grudging compliance, and some are going to be non-compliant. And you're going to have a tough decision to make as you're trying to bring diversity to your organization about what you're going to do at the grudging compliant and non-compliance level. Because it may be that they're the ones that need to go. If you really are committed to building a workforce and you can't get authentic buy-in, then it may be that there's some people that are openly hostile to diversity that aren't the fit in your organization and not the newcomers. I wanted to very quickly introduce, this is going to be a bit weird because I have to click right on that. Sorry. Just really quickly introduce our career engagement model because this is going to be super important for you to keep in mind when you've got internationally trained professionals in underutilized positions. People will be fully engaged, that green line, if they've got high capacity, which any internationally trained professional who was brave enough to leave the work they were doing and come to a new country, you've got a pretty high capacity person. If you're giving them a small challenge. So small challenge, high capacity results in underutilized or disengaged. However, we can have that same internationally trained professional concurrently overwhelmed because where they've got is low competency in understanding Canadian culture, Canadian workplace, really needs some help and support and mentoring there. So you can have someone who's overwhelmed, but not overwhelmed because they don't have professional competency. In terms of the professional competency, they're feeling underutilized. And there's lots of research that talks about the de-skilling of foreign trained professionals. So we're recruiting people into our country that have the skills we need that we have gaps in right now, like medical doctors. But if you have a medical doctor that's not allowed to practice for 5, 6, 7 years, at the end of that time, do we actually have a medical doctor that's ready to practice? So we have to be really careful about what we're doing in terms of underutilizing people. So there's lots of barriers to workforce integration, and these are the percentages. So language, 93%. For many of them, it is a barrier. Written language, probably not so much. Sometimes it's not a language problem, it's an accent problem. And so if we can get past the accent and understand the accent, the language might be completely fluent. Foreign credentials, huge issue, and then it gets down to membership in professional networks, which is where your mentoring programs can be helpful. At the FCR level, these are the most common barriers that are noted in research, and they are big and beyond us being able to fix in this room, but certainly important for us to be aware of and continue to advocate for. And in our foreign credential recognition research, which was with the foreign trained professionals themselves in focus groups, we found that the success factors for them were having a support system, financial support as well, flexible approaches, helpful programming, language proficiency, and also alternate career paths that made sense. Their barriers Interestingly enough, they named as a barrier the career service providers. They said there's people that don't get it. And the doctor dishwasher is just one example. You know, why? Because it starts with D? They turned to the D occupation page and found something that fit? I don't know. Maybe because doctors have clean hands and so do dishwashers. There's no logic to making a suggestion like that. And so people, and this is embarrassing to me because I train career professionals and have been the leader of the Professional Association for Career Professionals, but that came up as a barrier. Certainly discrimination. Canadians like to pretend we don't discriminate, we discriminate. And so we need to acknowledge that we discriminate and do something about it rather than trying to pretend that Canada is this beautiful mosaic of people, you know, that all coexist nicely. They do, but they don't work. And so we need to pay attention to that. The de-skilling was a big issue that came up with this group, pre-landing roadblocks and survival jobs. And so in your handout package, you've got 10 tips to support employers embracing diversity. You can find a soft copy of this on our website, lifestrategies.ca, so print it and use it as a poster if you want. And I'm really excited about joining you for the Global Cafe, because I think that's where the real learning is going to happen.